yeah, today's title of presentation, it's survive, strive, and thrive as the solo UX writer. So the basically three stages that I have summarized for the career of a solo UX writer, or at least like when you first started as a UX writer, you like the solo one. So just a quick update. So like Anna mentioned earlier, I'm still the solo UX writer, which is not the case anymore. A month ago, yeah, we have another UX writer joining the team. So I think, yeah, in a way, this presentation is also, kind of my journal of my own, like day-to-day job. So yeah, let's get started. So just, yeah, like I take just a couple of minutes just to introduce myself. So I'm a, like an engineer turned copywriter and turned UX writer. So yes, a lot of career changes, like over the past 6 years. So I actually did my degree in mechanical engineering. Then yeah, after just like I think 2 years, like I started getting into copywriting and I stumbled upon UX writing. So that's how I got here. And I'm I would say a self-proclaimed like language nerd. I personally could speak uh, four different languages and also like two different Chinese dialects. But I think that's quite usual in Malaysia. I don't think it's as impressive, but yeah. So I think like growing up in that environment, needing to like speak different languages with family and friends. I think that like learning different languages just captivates me. Like since ever since I was in high school or like university. So I think that's kind of like a reason, like why I'm in this industry now. So a quick recap of my UX career. So my first position as officially as a UX writer. Of course, before that, I worked in copywriting, which also like has a lot of projects that are quite related or quite relevant, to like what I'm doing now in UX writing. But my first official role as a UX writer, it's in Riget Plus. So it was basically a startup, Malaysian startup that focuses, like produce content on personal finance. And their main product is just to get, like people, normal day-to-day users to apply for banking products such as credit cards and personal loans through their WhatsApp chatbot. So yeah, that's my first position. Then after just a year, I moved on to Party Post. It's a Singapore-based influencer marketing tool. I didn't say influencer marketing company because they are not really an agency, but they make apps and also campaign manager software for people to manage their marketing campaigns. So this was my first experience serving like different markets, as you can see here, on this slide. They were in Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, basically most of Southeast Asia, and also Hong Kong and Taiwan. Then after about just less than 2 years, earlier this year, I joined Ant Group. So they are expanding like really actively now in Malaysia. So yeah, start of this year, like I joined their international subsidiary called Ant International, which the HQ is based in Singapore, but in Malaysia they are expanding really, really like actively now. So I think this is a very new experience for me joining first a way bigger company in the UX field, and also a Chinese company, which I have I don't have like prior experience before joining Ant. So that is why I'm here. So moving on. So I thought I would give like everyone a quick primer, before I get onto my topics, but my main topics, about how to survive, as a UX writer. I would do like a little comparison with the state of UX writing or content design, as I think it's more commonly known in China, where in Southeast Asia, I think comparing to China, we do have a lot of similarities, I believe. So first one, it's I would say like many teams when they hire UX writer, sorry, many teams like they don't have a clear or like thorough understanding of our role as a UX writer or content designer. Usually they'll reach out to us for quite a wide range of tasks, including tasks that you don't expect, or you don't like really think that a task like for really like for UX writers. But you just have to, like justify your value, of your role as a UX writer to stakeholders and your team leads as well by carrying on, like just moving forward with this task, regardless, of, like whether what you expect, is it something within your expectation, of UX writer. So I think, yeah, I took, like some of these powerful words, from Anna's and also Arnold's article, on UX Content Collective, I believe. So yeah, we do have a, pick our battles like quite often, and we are involved, like less in lower, like we definitely want to involve like less in lower priority projects and focus more on critical projects. So I think for, from this end, I definitely see, like quite a few similarities comparing to China, at least, based on what I have heard, from Arno, and also the article that Anna and Arno wrote. But I do think, there are a couple of differences as well. Like, let me, I'm not sure why I couldn't. That's like, okay, sorry about that. So for the differences, I would say the UX and design principles in Southeast Asia, most of the time, not entirely. We I do feel like, we are closer to Western principles, like the best practices that we adopt, or at least on paper, we definitely like adopt the less is more approach way more often. Less is more, applies to most apps and website that you see in Southeast Asia. But I would say, like the only exception is online or e-commerce marketplaces. I would say, yeah, those one, like we are closer to, Chinese websites or, like Chinese apps. So I guess, like when I first started in UX, I do have the observation that I feel like, we do follow a lot of Western best practices. And I would say launch first, it's rarely the develop a product development principle here. I would say, like we are definitely not as fast paced as, Chinese tech companies. But, like we don't put like enough emphasis on research as well. At least, compared to like American companies or, some European companies. But, like overall, I don't think, like we are able to match the pace, like that Chinese companies like adopt as well. So in a way, like we are kind of in the middle when it comes to, like the pace of your product development. Okay, then I will go to the next slide. So yeah, this is before I get onto, the main topic. I think this meme sums up, like what people expect of UX writer when you're, you yourself are not UX writer. So what friends think I do is, yeah, mainly, like a lot of writing. What parents think I do, yeah, they don't know what I do. I think, usually I think at this stage, they gave up quite a while ago explaining, like what I do, to their friends or families. And what designers think we do is, yeah, also, like just a lot of typing, a lot of just, like making words like, sound nice. But of course, that's not the only thing we do. And what PMs do, which, yeah, I think, I could relate. I do take in a lot of proofreading requests or, like grammar correction requests. And a lot of, other people might just group us in this group as, tech people. So they might not know, what exactly we do. And yeah, what we really do is a lot, but I'm gonna get into it in a bit. So yeah, part one, I think, just choosing and joining a team. I think for a solo UX writer, for every, UX writer, I think that's like critical. But I think especially now as in Southeast Asia, I think a lot of companies who started hiring UX writers, I would believe like majority of them are only like hiring for one. Most of the time, like we still don't have like a, properly or full-fledged UX writing team, per se. So I think, like choosing a team, before joining it is, like very critical. So based on, my experience for, these three jobs that, I had as UX writer, I think before joining it is very critical to find out or ask questions, like to the hiring manager or, to anyone, who interviews you, about any question that you have. But I, like just typically summarize it, into these three categories. I think it's very important to find out more about the team structure. And what I mean by that is, like how many people, in the UX team, or whether, like, are there a UX team? Is there a UX team? Because in my first job as a UX writer, I actually work with a bunch of product managers, and I report, to the head of product without any full-time designers. So I think, yeah, this is very critical, to find out, generally just, about team structure and who and which team, you report to. As I mentioned, my first UX writing gig, I report to the head of product, and I work with product managers. Then, moving on to my second job, I work with three other designers. Then now I work with, including, the team in China. I work with probably, like more than 50 designers, and like we only have, like, two UX writers in this team. So of course, I'm not saying, that should scare you away from, the gig, but it is good to find out, before you join UX team. And finally, the UX maturity of, the organization. This is very tricky to find out, like on paper, because they can always say that, like, oh, we are putting, a lot of research or a lot of resources on UX. But of course, like you won't really know fully until, like you actually join a team. So, to find out like UX maturity of the organization, I would encourage, you keep asking, like question to your manager, don't feel shy, during the interview. Always, like ask anything that you want to find out, like how, for example, like how much research, are they doing on a, like month-to-month basis, to make, like more user-centered decision. Or you can even, like ask something, how do they, make decision when it comes to releasing a feature. So I think, this like simple question might actually prompt them, to answer, to give, some insights, into like the maturity that, they have when it comes to UX. Yeah. So this is the part where, before joining Ant Group, my priorities, like today would be my reporting manager for sure. It would have to be, of like UX background. Think, like for my previous job working with, like managers who are of different backgrounds, including, product and tech. Sometimes, yeah, that can be a little difficult when it comes to, justifying, like the resources that you need, to carry out a project. So this is like the number one priority I have, at least, when I was interviewing for my current role at Ant Group. Then the second is the UX team, like should be matured enough to set their own objectives with, I wouldn't say like with zero, but with very little interference, from the business teams or for like the executors. Then you will be able to like hold open discussions, with other teams to prioritize like work effectively instead of just how I would call like firefighting, or just taking like all the requests that other teams have like for UX. So moving on, yeah, after joining a UX team, I break this down, into like three main, like areas that I think it is very important for your maybe your first 6 months, as a solo UX writer. Is, like to showcase your value, as a UX writer. I think that's always the first. And second is, managing expectation, for UX writers. And the final one, like handling critics, which I think this, is not only limited to UX writer. I think UX designers, like definitely have a lot of session, like when it comes to handling critics. But I think in terms of content or copy critics, it comes in, like a little differently as well. So I'm gonna share a little bit more. So yeah, in showcasing, your value as a UX writer, I think, yeah, it comes in like really, like a diverse, like set of, different forms that you might see when it comes to, showcasing your value. Because to me, how I would describe it is constantly a balancing act, between like you setting, the boundaries as a UX writer, what you are doing and what, like you shouldn't, like be doing. But at the same time, you do have to, like fulfill your team requests, like, day in and day out. I think, that's just part of, like how you showcase your value, even when it comes to, like tasks that are not within your expectation as a UX writer per se. So I would, like based on my experience, I think, like some of the team requests, usually would include like copywriting tasks, translation review, proofreading, or, very general, be the language expert, that's what you're hired to do. But, as much as we know, it's not only, like what we do, it's maybe more strategic or, like more higher level, than this. But in your first like 6 months or even to a year, I think it is very important to balance, like you should still take on, like some of these tasks to be able to show, like what you can do. So, like that's how you build, like relationship with, your team members and also your team lead. I will share a little bit more, in the final section, but, just I think, yeah, this is something like very important that I want to emphasize, for, like UX writer who just joined the company. So then, we have like a lot of requests. I think, like we are faced with this like dilemma that, I think this meme like really expresses, like I think a lot of us, could relate. We are even faced with tasks where, we are deciding which button will be the best, click here or learn more, which sometimes it doesn't really bring any like significant, differences, whichever button or whichever, copy that, you go with. But I think, like especially for a UX writer who is supporting, a lot of designers and, a lot of product managers, I think, you would be like faced with this question a lot. So how, like I think to start like setting boundaries as a UX writer earlier, in your uh career, like in a company, I think, first you should, define like what you thing, or like what you deem, like as like UX writing tasks. How I would, like really define it, it's uh any microcopies in any user flows. I do think, yeah, this is like within our wheelhouse. I think as much as, it is very execution based, it's not too much like strategic based approach, like at the start at least. I think, that's how we show, like value early in our career. Then it's also, I would say, like a hybrid, like when it comes to some pages, or, like some section in the app where it's kind of like a hybrid, like copy to like UX writing tasks, such as, like introduction pages where we would have to like exhibit, some benefits of a new feature, or even the, benefits of an app. I think, yeah, this is something that, like we do have to take on as well. And maybe, like I would say from my experience supporting like different markets, we do have to kind of safeguard a little bit on, like localization and internationalization like projects as well. Of course, like we, like I don't think we should be the one, who's like translating. Even if you are, like multilingual, I don't think, like we are, professionals, to be able to translate and localize like effectively. But, to review, I think, yeah, this, like it's part of my daily job like currently as well. And, like instead of being a language expert, I think, like how I would describe, our role, the most critical role is to be a guardian, of content that, like shows, on the product or the project that, like you are taking on. I think, like guardian, it's how I would, like really describe it, instead of, just an expert, for languages. Okay. Moving on. So the last part, I think, yeah, for design and, copy critics, I think, critics aren't all the same. I think that's the tricky part. Like it never comes in, like in the same shape, or, like same comment that you would already expect. Like day one you might receive, like one critic, and day two it might be, completely different. So I think for, at least from my experience, a lot of new UX writer, like might be overwhelmed, or even, like they're caught off guard, when it comes to, like this diverse set of, like critics, especially when you have your first proper, design review, or, copy review with like stakeholders. So yeah, definitely, I think, design critics and copy critics, can be unproductive when each stakeholders, like sharing different opinions without really like like a clear action, like, oh, what should I change, or, what should I improve upon. So especially I think for a bigger team, or, a bigger company, which, like I'm at, this situation right now. where you have maybe marketing or even like business team joining the session, then it becomes a very vow like environment where like you are taking in opinions from different people of different backgrounds. But I think comparing to like uh designers, I think that's one thing that like a lot of us UX writers have to deal with. That's one thing that like stakeholders were unlikely like to do. It's to change design on Figma or any other like mockup tools that you would use. But for copy, I think like I definitely have faced with a lot of like PMs. They might just change your copies because they don't think that like the copies are effective or clear enough. So in this sense, I think copy critics can be very unproductive. The stakeholders can always tell you like you can do better, you can write better, just because of the notion that everyone can write. So I think this is a very tricky bit, especially for like new UX people like joining a new team. So for now I think I won't like share too much of a solution. I think the like subsequent topics that I will share like over this entire session will definitely talk more about the solution. But take a deep breath. I think like for that's what I tell myself, like even till today, whenever like you come out of a really rough review session, take a deep breath. It's definitely very overwhelming, for especially a solo UX writer. But get used to it, and each critique, as like different or as like trivial it might be, it should still help you learn and get better. Maybe not all critics are supposed to to help you to make improvements to your copy per se, but you should at least like every coming out of every session you should learn practically or realistically how you would be able to like manage stakeholders better, for example. So as I mentioned, subsequent topics will help you get like more constructive, like run like more constructive and effective review session in the future. So how I think like a UX writer can start having more of a objective, like or impose a more objective look into UX writing and UX content for the team is to start like using tools and building systems. So for like I I would feel like like the most one of the most critical over my UX career, the most like critical project I have done, or this like a system per se that I built for companies. It's really just to like create a copy library. uh you know Again, start small. When I say like copy library, it started like it starts sounding like very overwhelming, where you are collecting maybe 2,000 or even to like 50,000, 100,000 like of different copies like inside one library. That can be overwhelming. But for a start, copy library can just mean like you are just compiling all the generic error messages and success messages. At least that's how I first started in my first role as a UX writer. But no matter how small or how robust it is, I think this is the first tool that you can showcase your value and justify like why a UX writer should be hired, and eventually like why you would need like a team of content designers. Because like through this like copy library, you know you would be able to showcase how consistent and how like reusable the copies you have when it comes to different, including across different projects and like different products. So how like I would advise starting a copy library project, it depends a lot on the team size, the resources that like that you're dealt with, and also like your leads like willingness to follow through this project. Pretty much like create a shortcut here. I think for most team, based on my experience, I would recommend using a ready-made tools, that are in market. I think Frontier and Detail are probably the two of the most like well-known, like Figma plugin, UX writing tools that you have, currently in the market. So I recommend, starting with that, for most companies and, teams that are of like mid-size or, like even of like smaller sizes. You couldn't go wrong, when you use a ready-made tools. I think that saves like a lot of, resources that you need. But even, when I say that, I understand, for my first role where it's only me as a UX writer, and I'm working with three product managers without any designers. For teams that are very very green and young, like in terms of UX maturity, I think it's even hard to really pitch like paying a monthly fee to like sign up for tools like Frontito and Dito. So for those cases, I would recommend like just start documenting your copies, your generic copies, as I mentioned, using a Google Excel sheet. It's not pretty, but like you have to start somewhere. And for bigger teams with a lot of resources and buy-ins, from your stakeholders, which is currently the situation in Ant Group, you have the opportunity to start building a system using like internal tools, and you actually have control, in deciding how the features, would look like, like what do you need to make sure this tool, work for UX writers first, and like expanding it to like UX designers and product managers. So yeah, this is like, it sounds the best, but again, this takes like the longest time and the most resources, to execute effectively. So the next thing, let's say, like once you have a copy library, it's time to establish, like content guidelines. So I would say, this is like stage two. After you compile like a copy library, you have a much better sense of, like how at least, like the most like critical generic copies that you see in the product, such as the success message, before, like you as a UX writer joining the team, how do people actually write? Like it could be previously, you never know. Yeah, you might not, be sure like who used to write copies. It could be the product managers, could be the designers, but this gives you a very clear view after compiling a library, a clear view of like how, do they actually see like in product content. So from there, like you can start establishing, some sort of guidelines or some best practices at least, to make sure that like people kind of get a feel of the changes that you are trying to make to the entire, product. But I would say, there's a caveat. As much as, like I think this is still needed and it is an effective tool. But things always look great, like when you first start, like, pitching, or even, like it's not you who pitch it. When you first join a team, maybe your team lead, like started, like asking you to come up with a content guideline. In my case, I think in my previous two jobs, I think the team lead, one of the first thing they asked me to do strategically, it's to like come up with a content guideline or a tone of voice guideline. So things always look great, like when your team lead, like they have a specialist, like writing a guideline that like it's something that they know, like they wouldn't be able to do effectively. So, I think from a team lead perspective, especially if they are not of like UX writing background, I think what would, like this idea excite them, this idea of a content guideline would excite them so much because they can show this, to the team and stakeholders, uh, feeling like, UX writers, could start like making designers, PMs, or even engineer, like start writing like a professional, like UX writer. Like they will stop seeing like back copies, all over in their mockups, on Figma. Just follow the guideline. It's that simple. But of course, like what I realized based on my experience, after establishing a guideline, you realize actually a lot of people don't follow the guideline, or even like most people, like they might not even read it at least in details. So you might like be thinking like then it's a waste of time. But why do we still have to do it? As I have called it, this is the stage two of like building system for UX writer here. I will talk more about like this in stakeholder management, but I think a content guideline, it's kind of like a platform, or a deliverable for you to actually manage your stakeholders and convince your stakeholders of the subsequent like strategic projects that you might want to carry out. So yeah, I'll share a little bit more like later on. And I think the highest, when it comes to building content systems, the highest, or the most like sophisticated level that I think we would be able to execute is really to integrate like content into the design systems that we have. So I think this is like, I wouldn't say the only way, but based on my experience, it's really like one of the most effective way if you can execute it like effectively. That's the way, to really achieve like close collaboration between designers and UX writer. This is like the key to really minimizing, like the manual workload that we have, for solo UX writer. And what I mean by, manual workload might be something that, you have to like edit five or even 50 screens, of the same copies. Then, like you have to update the mockup, like one by one. And, like when it comes to like manual work like this, it is definitely like a huge, like use of our time where, we could actually work on your more strategic projects. And yeah, I think, the key is really like if we are able to integrate like, content into design system, we, could like cut out a lot of this. Of course, like having a content design system per se, you shouldn't expect the designers and PMs will suddenly, become as good as you, like as UX writers, because I think, that would, make us lose our job, like first. But I think, yeah, that's not the objective as well in, like building content into design system. But how I see, like the key objectives are really like we are preparing a very content ready and content like informed, design mockup. When the designers are done, like when they are done with their first mockup, right away, they will be able to select like copies that are already like like that have been used before, and copies that are actually effective. So the first draft that, like that they hand off, like to UX writers and assets, to do like a copy revision or to do a copy review. That first draft, we want to make sure the first draft is already good. It might not be perfect, but it's already very good. As I listed, here, like they can select reusable copies for designs and components. That saves like a lot of, like our job in deciding, even including button copies that I shared earlier, in the meme, where, we are deciding, is it click here or is it learn more? So it saves, like a lot of like manual work and also like mental stress on just, deciding things that, we have decided, like for like probably thousands or millions of times. Then, like you wouldn't need to review, copies like page by page in a flow, if, they are able to, come up with a very like content ready, design mockup. So in this way, copy review becomes way quicker and it's very focused on, what we need to do. And at the end, your key task, like that the designers, would hand off to you is to craft copies for the most like critical and like newer, like designs and flows. So you wouldn't have to look into, like a save button, like over and over again. So yeah, as I, like I just want to show like some examples that I've done, previously in my, previous few job, where I talk about, for smaller teams, just use an Excel sheet. That's what I did, for my first role as a UX writer, where our key product, it's basically a, chatbot for a messaging app. So how I do it is just, like I keep track of, like all the messages that, we have inside. Maybe I would say we have like 20 over, like different flows. So some are generic and some, might be like specific, like to one, one specific flow. So I just keep track, like of all the messages that we have on an Excel sheet, and including, the option that we provide, like for our users. Then I started expanding it into, like listing it out, breaking it down into like different categories of, messages, such as, onboarding messages or reminder messages. And what are the type of, like message that we have here? Is it a question? Is it, just a recommendation or a push notification? And I think the last that I added is, like the tone, where I started experimenting. Of course, like the effectiveness can be questioned because I left, like not too long after I started experimenting, like adding, like the tone that, we have like for this message. But yeah, like you start with, like whatever you have, within your team resources. And yeah, this is, like kind of the humble beginning that I had, as my first role, in my first role, as a UX writer. Then eventually I move on to in my previous company, we signed up for Frontitude. And, in Frontitude, I think, this is, in a way, it cuts down a lot of, manual work of like keeping track of things, like in an Excel sheet or, like in any sheet that you use. because it's already built, like as soon as, like you sync your design from Figma onto Frontit, you'll be able, to start making decision on what to put inside the copy library, how to name, the components in your copy library. So this definitely make things like way easier, like when you want to, make like UX content more reusable and more repeatable. But a word of warning, I think for existing companies who never had like experience, using these tools before, I think it will still take like quite a while to really set up everything effectively, because it's not just only, setting up a copy library. You do have to make like a lot of decisions with the engineers and with designers, like what is the naming convention, for your copy components and this thing, and when it comes to like technical, how do you make sure this tool also, like work effectively for engineering kind of. So over like in my previous job, I think over the process of really setting everything up, I would say it took us like 8 months as well to set up properly, especially because they never had any similar tools that, like they never thought about, like how do you actually have a proper like copy like system, or building a, copy like ecosystem, per se. So that takes, like a lot of work, day in day out, to like plan before you could, even execute. But for teams that I think, if you first started, when you first start off developing a product, if you already have this sort of mindset, including like, just like using it on Excel sheet, if you start off with, a very like systemic like approach, I think using this tool, could be like way quicker. And finally, building an internal tool. I do recommend, like you guys to really look into this Figma config, like 2 years ago. I think, like this Pinda, it's a UX writer from Siam Commercial Bank. And she basically like shared like how her team just built everything from scratch on Figma itself. I do recommend, like I'll share it later as well in the chat room, for like this YouTube link. But I think, if you are a team, a UX like writing team that has like all the resources, to be able to do that, uh, definitely look at, like how, like she groups like everything, and how, she builds it. She even built like a browsing and searching, like mechanics, like inside Figma. So yeah, this is something that I'm also, personally working on currently in my team, because we do have, like some resources, to be able to execute that. But like I said, I think, this definitely, like with a lot of caution, like plan out properly with your team and see, if this is something that you have the resources for, and if not, it's always okay to use a ready-made tool. Okay, so I'm halfway through, to my sharing. So the next thing that I want to talk about, for solo UX writer, or like for any UX writer, I think, like after a few months into the role, as like you kind of master the art of, like writing micro copies, you started building some content guidelines, started building, some system. I think, like a lot, like including myself, I think, like I started getting overwhelmed when it comes to, like making sure, technically, how do I execute like all the, nice like, copies and nice like content strategy that I have set, for a product. How do I make sure it actually comes into fruition, at the end? And that, has a lot to do, with your engineers. Be nice, be friends, with your engineers. Like, how do you manage, the technical side of, like this area? So I would call it, this is the not so fun side of content design, because, you are no longer, like working, like to make a copy sound good, or localize, like a copy, or, and you are not, like even spending time, to do like proper content research, talking to user to find out, how they feel, about, like your overall, content for an app. This is, the part where you actually have to get real. How do we make sure, like everything appear as, like we intend? So after, like finishing that, like including me, I've done, like I've done that mistake as well. I thought, job's done, that copy would magically appear, like in your app or in your website, like just the way you intend. Time to celebrate? No, definitely not so fast. Like how do you make sure? this like carefully crafted copies would appear online, like as how you would design them. How do you work with the engineers when you realize there are some copies that like they are not appearing at the way that you intend? How do you work with the engineers to make sure that happens? So I want to share a little bit of this is like my previous and also my current job, where inside like my document I have like so many different version of like Excel sheet of like like different translation, different copies for like a project. And then in another, on another hand, you see like some projects, because as like a solo UX writer, I expect you to be, to actually to be taking on like, like different projects and different products, in one go. So that causes like chaos when it comes to like managing a technical side. So you can see here like I have like version management is one problem. And second, I have like this one project, using Excel sheet, to keep track of all the copies, screenshots, and also translation. Where, like the other project, we have like an internal tool that work like a almost like a translation management system, where I would, have to go into this tool and make sure all the copies are correct. If not, I will have to basically edit the copies, like without any design context here. And at the end, like we have some like I would call it like better workflows where we work directly on Figma, to correct copies. But as a whole, like I do have to juggle, between different workflows and different different deliverables when it comes to like delivering copies, to the engineers. So how do you manage, like this chaos? And like at the end, like you already done, like you already did, what you thought, like you should like do when it comes to making like all the copies like nice, and they all look good, they all like fulfill the like user needs. And at the end, like you see something, this is a screenshot from the previous app that I worked on in my previous job. So at the end you might still have like some of the copies appearing like this: bank details, like ID number, or like a submit button not looking like the copy that you actually wrote. Although it's as simple as submit, you're actually seeing a string called like button.submit. So like when the next release comes, it is a very frustrating experience. But this is what I like meant like by managing the technical side of content design. How do you make sure all this thing like you'll be able to work with the engineers to make sure it's executed like effectively? So the pain points, I guess like I have shared like over this past like 3 minutes, where the designers like why like this happened is because most designers, they are not UX writers, they are not content designers. They don't understand the nuances when it comes to like content management. So you can't just like rely on them to take on this discussion with the engineers, to set or establish a workflow with the engineers, like how do we execute like the copy effectively. So what usually happen if the designers like can take charge, then the engineers would go with their usual the BAU, business as usual, like the usual method, which is the most like convenient for them. If that means that you have to export like 200 copies, like 200 pieces of strings into an Excel sheet and edit them, one by one without any design context. If this is convenient for them, of course, like without anyone taking charge of the discussion, they would definitely, go with that. So a lot of the time, especially for solo UX writers who don't have like a mentor or a lead, to like really discuss like ideas, or even, just to kind of have, that experience before, how to manage like content, you'll be like blindsided, with like all this workflow. And this would eventually lead to, what I mentioned, like different workflows, for different projects, and a very manual process of, like copy update or copy edit, and late communication when it comes to tech constraint. This ultimately like affects our content strategy and the content structure for maybe one section of the app or even the entire app. Because if like we are blindsided with the workflow, what would usually happen is at the end the engineers will say that we have to launch this app probably in a month or in 2 weeks. and you wouldn't have enough time, to make like design adjustments that, like you have previously planned out based on, like your content strategy. So when it comes to your technical perspective, this is like very critical. So what you can do, as a UX writer to take charge when it comes to discussion surrounding technical content management, it's again like what I have said just now. If you are able to utilize all the tools and system that you have built, like some examples that I have shown like a few minutes earlier, you would definitely be able to avoid or minimize, at least not avoid like avoiding completely, but minimize, like some of the things that I have mentioned, where when we hand off the entire design copies to engineers, it might be completely different like structure from like the ones that you have without, because like when the designers work on it, we didn't think of tech constraint. If you are able to use like the content design system, for example, I think like the mock-up that you eventually hand off to the engineers, you'll be able to minimize like a lot of this technical constraints that they might not be aware of right before launch. So you'll be able to start aligning this design and also this workflow with the designers like very early, like in the process of like designing and crafting like copies for the app. So once like you're able to align the workflow with your designers, which is what you should always do, because they are like no matter like how unaware they are, when UX designers like no matter how much they don't know about your workflow, they are still your closest allies. Like whenever you start designing any copies and any flows, they are your closest allies, and you have to align with them when it comes to the technical workflow. And after like if like both designers and content designers or UX writers are aligned, you want to understand the key objectives from the PMs and the engineers. Like when I mean objectives, it's not just how I would call it, like objectives on paper. For example, objectives on paper would be, we want to launch this app by August this year. That's not the objectives that like UX writers should be seeking. The objective that you should be seeking is their day-to-day job, like which workflow would work out the best, while still like while we can still enable the PMs and engineers to carry out their day-to-day job. So very important note, different PMs and different engineers, they might have a different set of objectives as well. So when I say like aligning and understanding, it's not as simple as just calling a big meeting like between PMs, engineers, and designers, and just talk it out. Sometimes you do have to have like one-to-one discussion with each different like product manager or each like different engineer to really get down to the real objectives. So I'll definitely share more about this in stakeholder management. So I'll continue first for now. For doing stakeholder management, right? So after like as you can see, like I have definitely felt the burn before of managing like technical discussion, which at this point I still like have to feel the burn of like carrying all this sort of technical discussion with product managers and engineers. And I think like as much as you'll be able to utilize the tools that and system that you have set up, stakeholder management is still like I would call it like above everything else. You have to make sure you know how to manage like different stakeholders, different objectives. And what I mean by that is it is really just not as straightforward as it seems, especially for a new UX writer. I think for a lot of people, like inside a UX team or even outside a UX team, what stakeholder management, like might sound like it's just like as straightforward or as simple as like cross-functional team collaboration, or communication between people involved in one single project, or what I mentioned earlier, sitting in a meeting room and reach an agreement. But what it actually is, it's really understanding each team's, as I mentioned, what I said, about true objectives. What are their, true objectives? You have to figure that out and find the best ways, to really communicate with each stakeholder. getting alignment from like each of them. And this is like conceptually it sounds the same, alignment agreement, but it is very different from agreement. When I talk about alignment, it doesn't mean that they agree with everything you say, they agree with all the workflow or all of the systems that you have suggested. Doesn't mean that they agree 100% with it, but you do have to get like alignment from them, that they say, okay, out of like the options or the ideas that we propose to them, this works best according like to their objectives and also their workflows. So this is like what I mean by alignment. And next one is really finding allies. As I mentioned earlier, designers, more often than not, they are your closest allies. So, like definitely, like work together with them. And especially in the early stage, when you want to make sure, your copy would be able to execute it perfectly. But of course, it's not only limited, to the designers. If you have, product managers that you work very closely with, always reach out to the product managers as soon as you see like any roadblocks or any potential problems that might come out later on. Always reach out to them and raise it to them. Or later on, once you start working on the copy handoff or the design handoff with the engineers, find allies within the engineering team as well. Maybe, yeah, as I mentioned, some engineers prefer using the old method or the old way of doing things, but more often than not, you can at least find like one or two engineers who are actually open to like new ways of doing things, and always discuss with them and make sure that like their lead is like aligned with them doing that as well. And most important of all, I think it comes back to balance. It's really about balance between getting like visibility of your work and also setting boundaries around like your work as a UX writer. So the common pain points it's for UX writer when it comes to like managing stakeholders. It's I think this 5 points definitely most of you guys could relate, where you are brought in too late in the design process, and early on when you are brought into a project, it's you lack like clear expectation and objective of like what do they actually need from a UX writer. Is it just purely copy review, or is it like some content research to a certain degree where you have to make decision based on like user feedback. So this is something that I find like a lot of the time, a lot of teams never give out that clear expectation early on. And like once like they are done designing like the product, then you're asked to improve like some copies that are not that well written, but more importantly, the designs, like are quite broken, So of course, it would be possible for us, to fix, copies on, broken designs, but a lot of the time, we are still, asked to, take that on. And, even worse, without any proper context and backgrounds, of this project. And, like you'll be asked, to add, like add new copies, on an exported like Excel sheet without, like an overview of the entire product, and without like any design context, or even worse, like the design flow, like you don't even have that. You might just have a simple screenshot of the screen. So this is, I think this explains a little bit of the from like each party's like perspective, why stakeholder management is so tricky. It's like these memes I think explain a little bit of from the perspective of like product managers. Like they would always like be like stressing over like things when it comes to like maybe look at the second meme where the design is like 98% complete, and then like they might go in and change like something like to the design or to the product, and then the rest of like the design team, engineering team, like would have to okay put in extra work. We have to do another round of iteration. And I'm sure, like, of course, this is a joke. No offense, if we have any product managers, in this room, but to a lot of designers, UX writers, and engineers, we might have like towards the end of like a launching stage of a product, we might always find like, oh, whatever the product manager say, we have to execute. And then at the end, like it comes down, to like even as like a task as simple as where do we manage, like all of our copies or of our, like documentation is scattered across, different documentation. And this, like this caused like a lot of disarray, between like different teams and different, stakeholders. But it doesn't, need to be that way if we are able to like communicate it, communicate everything more effectively and get alignment like properly. And this is like maybe from like engineers point of view, to them they might like really hate they might really have like hard time with UX designers when they keep thinking that like the handoff is already done. Why are you changing the design? Why are you like redesigning a feature like over again when their job is supposed to be done? And then, from our point of view, it's, like we are asking them, to implement a design. They will tell you it's not possible due to like technical constraints. And at the end, this is what we get. The designers and UX writer, like what we design, and like when it comes to the, like testing app, or the staging environment, as I call it, like what they build is nowhere, like close to like what we have in mind when we design the product. So at the end, for UX writer, we always, like feel like we just really deserve a seat in the table early on. Like at least on Figma, as this meme, like explains like, a lot of UX writers. I'm not sure. I hope that, like any one of us, in the room, like are not facing that currently in your job, where you don't even have edit access, to the Figma file. But this is like what a lot of UX writers are facing. Like we just feel like we really deserve a seat on in the table way early. Like very early on. In the design stage. So I think you have to really sum this up. I talked a lot about pain points. It sounds like I'm just complaining about like stakeholder management, and like talking with like different people like engineers. But now I'm not providing a solution, but I think based on my experience, I will sum up how you can make this situation better. It's the methods of communication you use. And I think in a team setting, especially when usually you have like product managers, engineers, designers, or sometimes like researchers, or in maybe smaller team like startup, maybe the executives would even come in a meeting. I would say like it comes down to three key like methods of communication. The first one is the most obvious. You call a meeting with all the relevant stakeholders, talk it out, and make a decision. Then the second one, maybe like updates that might not require everyone's input, but it's still important, for everyone to know. You might just, post a question or post an update, like inside a chat group. And finally, the one-to-one discussion with like each stakeholder. So from my experience, all three are they are critical. All three are needed. They are all necessary, but you do have to figure out, with like different people and different teams, which communication works, like the best for them. So one-to-one discussion with each stakeholder, to me, it's how I would usually, like it's the weapon of choice, for me when it comes to discussing particularly like technical side of content design with engineers. Because I do notice, like especially when it comes to a bigger team like that I'm in right now, maybe like front end engineers and back end engineers, like they will have like completely different ideas on how to execute, and they might actually be looking at completely different databases as well. So what I found, like when you post just a question on chat group, and hoping that like and the engineer will answer your question, a lot of the time it's just either awkward silence, or maybe very like uncertain answer, where they themselves are not sure, because they might not be the responsible person for the question that you're asking. So I always like find, no matter how much time it takes, or how inefficient like it could look like, I find out like who are the responsible like parties, and then I have the one-to-one discussion with them. And like approach the communication, that's another part to it. I like I talk a little bit of method of like communication, but approach, it's also different. Approach, it's like when like you have to really like figure out how do you actually communicate. It's not the way that you use, as I mentioned earlier, one-to-one or a big meeting. It's more like figuring out, like what drives them. So to get alignment, with stakeholders, or like better yet, yeah, you want to turn them into your allies. You have to find out, like what is this person like, like driven by, outside of like reaching, like the team objective. What are they, driven by? So I, like basically broke it down into these like three main groups. They are either experience driven, data and research like driven, or trust and relationship driven, or they can, like be, combination of two. Combination of all, it's possible as well for some person, for some people, but it's less likely. Usually it's either one, or two. So just to wrap it up, I think what I mean by experience driven, it's whether, like this person is convinced, like by your experience in content design and UX writing. I find that, like maybe some, out of the three team leads that, I reported to in my UX career, some, like leads are very driven by, your experience, because they are the one, who hired you. They have basically gone through your background, what projects you have done. So this one, like I think it's a little bit more straightforward, where whenever you present a certain like project, or you propose, like a strategy, you always come from a point of view that you tell them that, you have the experience of handling similar projects. You have the experience of handling, for example, handling different markets. So when it comes to localization, you tend to, like have that feel, or have that taste, like what, what works and what doesn't. So when it comes to a stakeholder, who is experience driven, you just have to, keep figuring out, like based on your past projects, what, you have done, and tell them that, like you have seen, success, like based on the, past like projects that you have done. But again, not all team leads or stakeholders, like that experience driven. Some might be very data and research driven. Some, like no matter what you say, I have experience in, A or B, in project C, they still want to, look at some sort of data, some sort of research. It can be, qualitative, or it can be quantitative, but you do, in this case, you do have to, like no matter, like how much time you have, figure out a quick way, like if you don't have like a lot of resource, for user research or content research, figure out a very quick way, to do a quick A/B test, for example, and then show them, like, oh, out of, the people that we test with, it could just be like, five users that we test with, like maybe, more users, would tend to go with option A. So this sort of, stakeholder always, back up, like your proposal with, some sort of data, no matter how, little time you have, try to see like what is the quickest way you are able to generate, some sort of data. Then the final one, I think, trust and relationship. What I mean by that, I think in some ways, you can also call it managing the politics of, like, being in UX team and working with like different people, especially, like when all the executives come in, on marketing come in. It is, like I think it has something to do with like a little, politically, like a little politics as well. I would say a little political, because they do have to trust you, like no matter what, like data, like you provide, or what experience, like you could show them. It still comes down to whether this person is aware of, like the, like your role, for a start. Like, do they even know, like what UX writers actually do, day in and day out? And second, like, are they aware of the contribution that you provide, like to the entire like company? So this, I think, this involves a lot of like building trust and relationship. So in this case, I think when, like you want to convince, a stakeholder based on, like trust and relationship, it takes the longest time, because you don't have like, like the opportunity to connect with like different stakeholders every day. But what I would suggest is always, early on, figure out, like with your product managers, with your designers, or even your team lead, who is who, like which team does what. At least, know the key person. So when you really need it, like just reach out and, like introduce yourself. And, this is like the like beginning stage of how you would actually improve trust and relationship with someone. At least they are aware that you exist, and like what does your role like contribute to the entire project. So yeah, this is I think for like my sharing about how you be able to survive and like thrive as a UX writer comes down to these four parts. I hope like you guys find useful. But as I mentioned, like at the start of sharing, finally I'm no longer the solo UX writer in my team. So we brought in like another UX writer just over a month ago. So how do you like thrive beyond the solo contributor role? I think this is something I just list this now. I'm like my presentation is basically done, but I'm just listing these few items down because it's also for myself as well. Where these are the focus areas that I'll be getting into to make sure that I would be able to grow like beyond the individual contributor role, where maybe in the future I'll be able to mentor and manage like some UX writers under my wing. And I think to be able to do that effectively, these are four focus areas that I have, and I would suggest for currently solo UX writers, maybe this is something that you can start thinking about once you establish like all the systems, like you think that you are already like getting stakeholder management quite right. And I think yeah, these are the four focus areas like you can start thinking about before or after you get in like more UX writers joining a team. And these are like content governance. What I mean by like content governance is making sure all of the systems and guidelines you build are followed mostly like by the team. Then second, like setting up like content testing framework. So instead of like what I talked about earlier, if you don't have time and resource, but you need to test, do a quick A/B test instead of like doing an ad hoc test, like every time. Start setting up like content testing framework. This is something I'm working on really diligently as well currently. Like even if it's just a quick A/B test for copies, always like start up like already start establishing the objectives, the generic objectives that you have for every test that you're going to run, and like how you're going to do it, document this down. And then this would eventually allow you to you know collect data and tracking metrics like more effectively. I think a lot of us can relate. For UX content, I think one of the biggest challenge, it's really to how do you measure. Like a lot of the time, even when we explain to stakeholders or your managers, it comes down to a lot on like subjectivity of like what makes a good copy. So if you are able to like set up testing framework, you'll be able to collect data more effectively and track it in a very systematic level. And the end, I think this a lot of people probably have come across a lot of articles recently about AI model. So I would say like when it comes to this area, I'm the least experienced. I haven't really scratched the surface of establishing an AI model for UX writing. But I think to be able to really evolve beyond the individual contributor role, I think we do have to start exploring how can an AI model make our job as like a UX writer day in and day out much easier. So there's something I will explore, and I hope in the future like any of you guys would present like one of the topics over here as well. I would definitely like attend your session if you are sharing anything that is related to this topic. So yeah, we at the end of like my sharing. So thanks everyone, really like thanks everyone for joining. Any question like you can ask now, or if like any question that you thought of later, or you just want to reach out on social media, do reach out via LinkedIn. This is my profile name, Jensen Wei Jian Lo. And more intimate way of like reaching out, I don't know, connect with me at my email at jensenlo1127 gmail.com. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Oh my God, your presentation was so information packed. I feel like you touched upon so many different aspects of governing content and being solo UX writer. And what struck me the most is the whole implementation part, because I feel like I can listen to you just talking about that for another hour, to be honest, because it's such a rare topic that people don't often bring up somehow. It's mostly all about writing, but how do you make sure that it's implemented right? Speaking of questions, during your presentation, we did get 7 questions in the chat. So let's go over those. So the first question is from me. Haha. How do you work with different languages, and what is your current localization process?
Yeah, so currently, my experience so far, when you're working with different languages, it's my previous job and my current. So my first role, yeah, we only work with English. So in my previous job, we have like a lot of mainly like Southeast Asian languages such as Indonesian, Thai. So for that, we definitely don't have the expertise to translate. I wouldn't even like attempt to do that. In my previous company, we don't have resource to like engage with a translation agency as well. So what we have, we reach out to either ops or marketing team from different markets. So we ask them to translate, then integrate it to the tool that I talk about, and like building a copy library. So a tool like Frontitude, you'll be able to keep track of all the translations for each copy inside Frontitude. So that kind of gives a much better way for uh, even they are not like expert, they are not professional translators, but this gives them much more context where they have view on the design flows directly, to be able, to translate. So I think, like that is one. So it has a lot to do with the tool that you use. Whereas when it comes to our current role, uh, I don't have the luxury of doing that because it's a much bigger company, and I'm sure like Anna, you'll be aware where we don't have the luxury to be able to share Figma link to like outside like agency to external agencies. So a lot of the time we still work with Excel sheet like a lot. So what I could do like to the best of my capabilities is to when I share screenshot, it's also to share much more context where like we might even export the entire glossary for this product, then share it to the agency, and have them like let them have a better overview of like the word that like we use, including something as simple as like sending or transferring like which word we prefer to use. So we try to send that kind of like glossary to them so they are aware, and towards the end, of all the languages that I know, I would do a quick review just to make sure that like it fits in to the context that we intend to. But yeah, this is like I would feel like in no way perfect. I am still working with the team to see like how in the future we will be able to at least have them like they have at least a certain degree be able to look at the entire flow. Yeah.
Wow, thank you so much. Yeah, it's quite tricky between different tools when you have to move
Yeah.
from Figma to agency.
Yeah.
That's a whole other deal. Speaking of creating copy for different markets, our next question from Pedro. You mentioned you worked with different markets. How hard was it to create copy that would suit all of them? Do you think there is a common denominator between them?
It is extremely challenging when it comes to, like if you want to really hit, like the perfect like localization. I think that is probably, like very little companies like probably, like achieve, like that level of like really good localization. In fact, yesterday I just watched the previous sharing about, like UX writing, like across, different cultures. I think, from after watching that sharing and comparing to my experience, I think we achieve very little when it comes to so far like at least the ability that like we were like be able to achieve. It's still very little where it's just a lot of translating and make sure that like very it's a lot on just like glossary level when we make sure that this glossary makes sense for this market, for example Indonesian market. Does it make sense to them in this glossary? And in my previous company, I mentioned, I work in like an influencer marketing company. So the most like, like that we were able to do for, let's say, Philippines, where we know a lot of their social media users are way, like younger, like they, like love using, like TikTok. So the best, like to my ability that we could do is for push notifications or what we would, use terms like, hey besties, like, more like Gen Z, terms that you're like able to use. But I would say that is still very surface level. It's like it's still not system, like systemic. It's not like we are able to make sure that like everyone would be able to like oversee this entire process of localization. So it is very challenging. Like if you want to reach that level of every market having different different content that they see. But the common denominator, I would say, always, like hire people who are multilingual, like because I think, no matter what, as like, for example, myself, like, uh, not saying that, like I would know, like what's good, for a language, for every languages, because some language I might be speaking, but, like, it's not my native language, but I do find, like what's in common is, even when we do the review, yes, it's not perfect that we won't be able to achieve, like 100% like localization. But even when I do the review, right away I could, like tell maybe it's not something to do with the translation. It's a lot to do with, my English copy, where I'm using a sentence like chill out, or I'm using a sentence of what's one that like a couple of months ago, like I came across this copy where we are telling people to, let's say, hang in there. Like these are the sentences that are quite difficult to be translated, especially for Asian languages, because we don't have an equivalent for that. So what like might usually happen at the end of it, it's either a very generic and boring sounding copy where instead of hang in there, you just wait for us for a few seconds, in translation, or it can be just direct translation where it makes like like zero sense, to the users, to the target users. So once I think if like you have enough teammates, like in your team who are multilingual, you will naturally have a sense. Even you couldn't achieve localization, you'll be able to achieve so-called like internationalization, where you when you write copies, you're already aware that this is going to be translated into multiple languages. Make sure it's easy for translators to translate. Only until you have like internal resources to localize, then like maybe that's another discussion where you go into the room and talk with the translators how they have the freedom to localize. But when you don't have that, it's very important to start considering the translation factor when you write like English copies or any copies in your native language. Yeah.
I think what you just said makes a perfect segue to the next question.
Yeah.
Question from Christine. She's asking, do you have tips for writing easy to translate copy?
Good question.
Amazing question.
Easier translate copies, I think it comes with experience, because like when I first started it, especially like my first company, it's we purely operate just within Malaysia without like any market outside of Malaysia. So that makes it more easy, like when it comes to making decision. Even you want to use some casual or colloquial like languages, you would like you wouldn't think twice, because even if that's the tone that I'm going with, most of your users will understand. But when you work with like different markets, then you have more experience that if I write like hang in there, if I once you start seeing like the translation, no matter if it's like internally or from external agency, you start seeing like a lot of really funny like translations. So that's like the experience that first you get. And then from there you realize you have to do it. I think, yeah, that's for a start, before knowing how to write like good, easily translated copies. Second, a tip that I would say, it's read a lot. I think like read a lot of like different articles, particularly like about such as like your article, Anna's and Arnold article where you talk about content design in China where it's not really that common, like at least now, not many people talk about it. So you read a lot of articles and go through a lot of apps, and even sometimes like which is like what I'm doing currently on a daily basis, where I go to website. For example, currently we are building uh, how do I call it, a cross-border payment tool, such as Wise. Like our competitor will be Wise. So yeah, we are building a tool that like will be competing with Wise. So I would like day in and day out go to like Wise and Revolut to check out their website in German. Just to okay, of course I like I could understand German to a certain like level, so I'll be able to understand a bit. But even if you couldn't understand, it's still very good to look at how the structure might look like, because suddenly you see like as soon as you switch from English to German and then to Chinese, suddenly the design layout becomes different. So I think that gives you a sense that how that's I think that gives you a clear sense that like to how different things look when you switch to from one language to another. So I think that's another tip, like maybe it's not too much into like writing itself, but you get a sense that like when you write something like longer in English, this might not work well when you're when you're translating. And I think final one, just to give one on, like purely writing itself, always, like use simple languages. And when I say, like when you have a team, of like diverse backgrounds and multilingual people, naturally, like even you yourself, might not be multilingual. You can always reach out to your team and ask like, oh, I know, English is not your native language. Like, how you would say something, even something as as simple as please hold on for a few minutes, how you would say it. So I think like Stephanie like shared this in the previous sharing as well, where in Malaysia and Singapore we English, it's almost our second language, I would say, where a lot of us are fluent in English, but it's still like not like in the UK or like in America. So that kind of cultural context gives us a feel into maybe in Malaysia, like instead of saying sure that works, we just say can. Yeah, like so when it comes to that, like writing like like easily translatable copies has a lot to do with how you think, like from a foreigner's perspective. If English is not his first language, how like would he actually say this sentence, or how would he read? Even if we are writing a very Americanized like sentence, such as like break a leg, you know like that is like always like gonna be hard to be translated. But if we write like something that like good luck in your next journey, if you write a copy like this for like a foreigner, when he reads it, he might like just be reading it as a good luck, then like he understands, like he doesn't read like the subsequent like words that you use, no matter how long you write. Maybe to him it's just scanning through the copy. So how I would define like easily translatable copies, a lot of the time, I wouldn't say like completely equal to, but a lot of the time it correlates to easily scannable copies. You want to write copies that like especially foreign users would be able to scan the keywords. I think that tend to have like a very close relation with like easily translated copy. Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more when it comes to plain language.
Yeah.
Simple things as like title case in English can
Yeah.
cause so many issues in say like Slavic languages when it's completely it's done completely differently. Yeah, thank you for these great tips. And then we have two questions from Ashley, which I think we can combine into one because they kind of connected. She's asking, as a solo UX writer, how were you dealing with RUG writers, aka non-UX writers, writing their own UX copy? How did you manage it? And the second question is, how do you get your team to actually use the content guidelines that you create? Or is it doomed to be ignored? Actually,
Okay, great. Yeah, I think that's a very great question, especially the second one. I think a lot of us could relate, like to that. No one just, like no one wants to follow a guideline. But yeah, I start off, with the first question. How do you make sure of that? I find, like I just, like share a little bit, about, my experience coming from a Singaporean, like company, based in like Southeast Asia, uh, and, transitioning into a Chinese company. One of the things that I'm really delighted joining a Chinese company is because I was brought in due to like my, of course, yeah, my UX writing experience, but second, it's a lot on your globalized view on things. And like more often than not, we are English first when it comes to written content. So I would say this is the second like main reason why I was brought in to a Chinese tech company like Alipay and Group. But with that, saying, I think, it makes it way easier in my daily job where there are less people because, not that many people are, proficient in English, or, they might not think that, they are proficient, especially when it comes to written. So they would let you to have the freedom, to craft copies first. They might send you some examples, of the competitor like apps and stuff, and ask you, oh, why is it different? Yes, I do, like receive questions like this, but on the whole, what I found, like in current company, it's less people come and bug me about like, oh, why do you make the decision, to drop the pronouns, from this sentence? Because in a way, like they do have the mindset that, you will know better than them. So I think one, with joining which kind of company according, to your own career objectives, I think that's like that answers the question. But second, if you're already in a team, how do you want to make sure that it's better? I think always, like it comes down a lot to stakeholder management. In my previous company, I think yeah, I do receive like way more question or like request to relook into a copies because like, oh, why are you dropping the pronouns from this sentence? Because like they maybe their native language would be English, so they would think that, oh, that's just grammatically like incorrect. So that like those sort of situation, I think there are two parts to it. One is stakeholder management. Once like you build, especially when it comes to the trust and relationship approach, when you use that approach, like initially for sure, like they will always, like bug you, like about, like, oh, why are you making this decision? Like every tiny little like writing decision. But once you're able, like to really show them every time, like in a project, like this sort of decision that you make, either they make like no impact, like changing it doesn't make any impact, or like even better, like you have shown that to the user this is much better for them, like maybe you can show it, through the test like completion rate to them. It's like way easier when you cut out like all these pronouns or articles. It's easier for them to scan like the page or scan the product. Then it's easier for them to complete a test, or the time like taken for them to finish a task like is way shorter. So that like it depends on like again use the framework the approach that one of the three like approaches that I suggested, but it has a lot to how much they actually trust you. So if you can show it often enough, at least on a peer level, I would say, like more often than not, you will still be able to show a little bit on, like how, you actually know, you know your stuff. You're not making decision, just purely, like, oh, just because you like it. Or you show that, even you make decision just purely because you like it doesn't make any effect. So, that comes in, like a lot of, it needs some time. So that's one. But second, that's when your guideline comes in. Of course, like I'm gonna answer a little bit on how do you convince, like people to use your guideline. But once you have like more, deliverables like a content guideline or even a content design system, they might not be convinced of, like the decision you make, but you can always say this is documented. You can always point them, like back to like this has been documented and it has been agreed, like among stakeholders or like within the team, it has been agreed. So you can always explain it's not perfect, but this is the direction that we are going with as of now. So I think yeah, that like would make it less likely for them to change the decision that like like you are making. So yeah, I hope like that is something. It's still very challenging. I get it. I think like I can resonate with this problem, but maybe this field approach like might minimize the issue a little bit, I think. But yeah, I know you're gonna
Yeah,
say something.
I totally agree what you said about guidelines and the fact that it's one way to set a standard and make that
Yeah,
standard applicable across the whole organization. Pretty much, you using the power of authority at this point, right? Hey, you
yeah,
might disagree, but this is how we do it.
yeah.
Yeah, and for Ashley, if you're interested in adapting style guides and kind of scaling it across the organization, getting more power behind your style guide, you might want to check the recording of the very first meetup that we did in September, where
Mm.
I talked specifically about that, how to implement style guide and how to convince your stakeholders to use your style guide, pretty much. And my main learning in that area is that your style guide has as much power as the highest authority who put a stamp of approval on it. To put it simply, it got approved by your team leader. It has the power of your team leader. It was approved by the head of design. It has the power of the head of design. It was approved by your CEO. Nobody can ever challenge your style guide ever. When you say, "Hey, you have problem with that awkward comma," you can discuss it with CEO. That stops many conversations. Many conversations. But yeah, absolutely fantastic question, and I hope we answered you, Ashley. And we're really running out of time. Last question from Pedro. Absolutely fantastic question that I feel also deserves a whole big conversation. Do you have any tips to ensure a smooth collaboration between content designers, engineers, UX designers?
A tip. I think yeah, this again like comes down to stakeholder management. I won't really. I don't have like one tip per se. I think it's really like about what you do like day in and day out. How you. But what I would say it's always take like confrontation or conflict as an opportunity to learn how you can communicate better and how you could do stakeholder management better. Because once like a conflict like happens, it's like especially if like it's after the first time like it happens, always be like open minded as well that like it is equally between you both as well. Yeah, like you can call him names, like whatever, like not in your own room, like that's like up to like your own like discretion. But after that, always think like if it happens, like only for like the first time, always think of like what you could do better, like from your from your side, because I think it's a lot on how to like really convey the message, right? Sometimes it's just because like the message isn't being conveyed, like maybe like one of the parties are just too quick to really like prove their point correct, as or saying that the old way of like working, it works, like you don't need to change it. So what is it like that person, when once when you have a conflict with, can be an engineer, can be a product manager, always figure out their real, like again going back to their true objective. It can be as simple as like their true objective is to make sure that everything looks good to their lead, as as how to say, like as realistic as it sounds. It's true, like I think a lot of team members, like maybe they are not thinking too much about product. For them, their day one objective is really to impress like my boss. So if it's, if you have like drilled down that this is really their objective, then think of it from their perspective, like if I want to implement like my way of doing things, how do I make sure this still make him or her look good in front of his boss, that he would be able to carry out his day-to-day tasks without having his or her manager questioning like, oh, why are you changing things? So that can, like be done in a lot of different ways. Maybe you can reach out, to, his or her manager directly as well and ask like, oh, what's the problem, like with this way of implementation, just to understand, like from a higher level, like what's stopping them, what is the roadblock. So I think, like one tip is always, to figure out like, I think different people, have different motivations, different objectives. And second is they might prefer, like a different way of like communicating. So that's why just now I emphasize a lot on one-to-one communication, because I think, more often than not, like that's when, like people, they might not, word it in a way that is so obvious that, like the objective, they might still want to shield it a little bit and, like sugarcoat it a little bit. But it's true, like one-to-one discussion that you start to kind of figure out and nail down, like what are they actually seeking for, in a project. And from there, like you'll be able to, to get them, to open up a little bit more and a little bit more, about, what problem do they see, or, like actually they are convinced, but, they don't have the resources to do that. Then, if it's something that on your level that you'll be able to achieve, let's say just, like making an engineering workflow like look more, how do I put it, like easily readable, then you can, always come up with a workflow, draft a flow chart, for the engineers and say that, oh, could you show this, to your team lead, and, like so he could understand, what we are trying to achieve. Or if it's something that involves, which I think a lot of the times where you don't have enough authority to really, like get him or her to achieve the objective, such as, things like I don't have enough resources. Yeah, maybe on your level, especially as a solo UX writer, it's hard, to like go to the engineering lead and, ask for more resources. I think, a lot of us know it's not as straightforward as it is. If it's something like that, then you will have to, like reach out, to your manager or your own, team lead, to have like discussion like this, because they are the only one who would be able to, provide that authority, to discuss, this sort of issue. So I guess, like also figure out like, is it a, ground level issue, or is it, on much on a team level issue? Yeah.
I find it fantastic how you make this clear boundary between objectives versus real objectives.
Yeah.
Yes, we can declare how much we care about user experience or growing certain metrics, but in the end, maybe we are working to please our manager.
Yeah.
I think we all had experience working with stakeholders like that. That's incredibly important, and I think it's also something that, again, not very often being brought up in the content community. I would love you, Jensen, to write an article about exactly that, like how to connect with people and how to find their real objectives, maybe with some stories and case studies. I would absolutely love that. I think we need more of that. Absolutely.